Welcome to our first introductory lesson on the Byzantine Empire and Islamic civilizations. So we'll get to Islam in a couple lessons, but first we want to focus on the Byzantine Empire. So our goal today is for you guys to walk away from today's lesson being able to learn exactly what was the Byzantine Empire in the first place. So to get started, let's do a quick review question. Can you identify the name of the empire that we've studied in this class that at one point controlled all the land around the Mediterranean Sea? Pause the video for a second and ask yourself, do you know the answer to this question? If you said Rome, then you're correct. On this map here, you can see the Mediterranean Sea and the Mediterranean world. Everything in red here, obviously the blue is water. The blue is the Mediterranean Sea right here. We got Italy, we've got Anatolia, Greece, Egypt, North Africa. We got Gaul, all these places we talked about in our Roman unit, and it was all controlled by the Roman Empire. That's the red on this map, and you can see it completely surrounds the Mediterranean Sea. Now, for a little more review, you might remember that the Roman Empire got too big for one person to control, and so they split it between the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire, with a capital in the west in Rome and a capital in the east in Constantinople. Each of these were considered to be co-emperors, meaning both were in charge, but really they're only responsible for their half of the empire for the most part. You remember this didn't end well, as there were plenty of civil wars where one emperor wanted to be in control of everything, so they'd go to war with the other one. Didn't really end well for the Roman Empire. Now, you remember that the Western Empire was weakened quite a bit over the last few centuries of its existence because, well, the East had everything of value and the West didn't really have much. The West was also experiencing a myriad of problems. For instance, here on the political end, you can see that they were having problems because the military was interfering with politics, there was civil war, the empire was divided in two for the most part, and the main capital had been moved from the western city of Rome to the eastern city of Constantinople. Other problems included the fact that people really didn't see working for the government as a job worth having anymore. Socially, people just weren't interested in politics and government anymore. People thought the government was corrupt, that people weren't loyal to the idea of the government. There's a huge gap between the rich and the poor, and there's even a decline in population because of disease and food shortages. Economically, the crops weren't growing, so farms were failing. Trade routes were being disrupted by all this war, so it wasn't safe to travel and trade. They're running low on gold and silver, which always came into the empire because of conquests, but they weren't conquering any new lands. The tax burden was pretty crushing, and the gap between the rich and the poor kept getting wider. And then on the military end of things, you can see that there was a threat from northern European tribes at the same time that they didn't have the money in Rome to pay for a professional military. We also learned about in our primary source readings how the soldiers were getting lazy, they didn't want to train anymore, they didn't want to wear their armor. And so then the military was no longer being loyal to the government, they were loyal to their individual generals, and this created a lot of problems in the West. So those are all kind of the underlying factors that weakened the Western Empire. Hopefully you remember this from our end of the Roman Empire unit. Those were the underlying causes. The immediate cause, though, was the fact, as you might remember, the Huns were coming in from Asia into Eastern Europe and were invading the land of Germania that we talked about. So the Germanic tribes were seeking refuge, safety in the one place that over the previous 500 years had been a pretty safe and stable place, the Western Roman Empire. They moved in, but the Roman Empire itself was pretty much in shambles at this point, so they didn't have the resources to support all these newcomers. At the same time, the newcomers were desperate for, well, pretty much everything. This led to a lot of conflict, and eventually these Germanic tribes kind of taking over, and really by the end of the 5th century, there was no longer an emperor in Rome, and we say the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist. At this point that we start no longer talking about the Roman Empire, but historians call what was left in the East the Byzantine Empire. Now, it's important to know that the people who lived in the Byzantine Empire would not have called it this. They would have kept calling it the Roman Empire. In fact, in the East, in the Byzantine Empire, they didn't consider themselves Byzantine. They called themselves Romans. And they continue to live a lot like the Romans did for the next, 1,000 years, really, with all the technological improvements of Rome and building on that. So the name Byzantine Empire is actually constructed by later historians looking back at history and trying to differentiate what lasted in the East from what fell apart in the West. So here you can see why was it such a rich place? Well, culturally speaking, they had Greece, right? We talked about all the cultural riches of Greece in our Greece unit. They had Egypt, which was an even older civilization, which had a lot of gold and produced most of the food for the empire. And at the same time, they had the western area of Mesopotamia. There's a lot of gold here, a lot of food, and a lot of cultural riches here as well. Not to mention the trade routes that connected from Asia to all the way east to China, and then down to Africa as well, the riches we talked about there. So all those trade routes kind of combined here, making the East a place to be. They really had everything of value. Timeline-wise, we're looking at our timeline of the Roman Empire. We can kind of see here in this yellow box, this is the period we call the existence of the Byzantine Empire. Now, you might remember from our earlier unit, that the city of Rome was founded, mythologically speaking, about 2,700 years ago, around 700 BCE. It was a republic from 500 BCE until around the year 20 or so BCE, when then it turned into the Roman Empire. You notice again it's split east and west, but a few years after that split is when we start calling it the Byzantine Empire and not really the Roman Empire anymore. We consider this the Byzantine period. You'll notice that within about 200 years of that split, the West has fallen, and well, the Byzantine Empire is still going strong for about another 1,000 years. What else is going on in the world at this time of the Byzantine Empire? Well, the Byzantine Empire really becomes a thing around the same time that Aksum in Africa is peaking in power. This is about 300 years after the birth and life of Jesus of Nazareth. It's around the same time that the Prophet Muhammad creates the religion of Islam in the Middle East. But it even exists for such a long period that you see here. This is the period in which the Swahili city-states start to become a thing. The Kingdom of Benin, Great Zimbabwe, Mansa Musa's Haja, these things we learned about in our African civilizations unit. Now, why did the West fall and the East survive? Well, we talked about the reason the West fell, but let's talk about why in the East the empire survived. A lot of it had to do with the capital of Constantinople. This was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, also we're calling the Byzantine Empire. So you can see here, this is a city of Constantinople. It's surrounded by water on three sides, and this line right here is demarcation of the walls of Constantinople. And now the walls of Constantinople were very important in keeping the Eastern Empire afloat and protecting it from invasion. Right? Why it wasn't conquered? So this is just one section of the walls of Constantinople today, right? So this is, 2020, right? About when this picture was taken. And the empire itself fell around the year 1500. So this is still 500 years after the fall of the empire. Walls still looking good. Why were these walls so great? Well, let's take a look for a second at this diagram. So you can see here that in order to get into the city itself, if you're an invading army, you had to go through a moat, right? So this area was a ditch that could be flooded at a moment's notice from the city and then drained out when they needed to. And so you had to have an army cross across this moat. Then you had to go through a channel and then get through this wall. And then if you get through that wall, you had another channel and then another even larger wall. And then each of these parapets, these tops of the towers, you'd have archers firing down at the invading armies, making things extremely difficult, right? Now, to make things worse, they also had something called Greek fire, which was basically a chemical like modern napalm that would explode into fire upon contact, and it would light you on fire, and if you jumped into the moat to try to put yourself out, well, tough luck, because this stuff wouldn't be put out by water. So you'd also be drowning at the same time you're burning alive. The walls of Constantinople, extreme protection for a city. Now, I do have a video that I normally show in class about the walls of Constantinople. Highly recommend watching it. It's a TED Talk. I'm not going to play it here in this video, but I will link to it at the end of the video. Really recommend watching it. It's about 5 minutes long. I think you'll be impressed with these walls. Now you see here a map of the Byzantine Empire. This thing lasted for 1,000 years after the Western Empire fell, so the borders of this empire changed dramatically over that 1,000-year period. From its largest extent, using this red line here, to its smallest extent, the dark red. But on average, it was these lighter red places were controlled by the Byzantines, give or take, over time. It was really the Emperor Justinian and his wife, the Empress Theodora, that expanded the empire with the dream of reuniting the West with the East and kind of getting back to those glory days of Western Rome when they controlled the entire Mediterranean Sea. He almost accomplished this, but the areas he did gain control of, there really wasn't much of value and resources there. So over time, the later emperors kind of just gave up on the western areas and focused on the east, where again there are all these trade routes and all these valuable resources. So there was periods where the emperors in the east were trying to reclaim the lands of the west, to varying degrees of success. Now let's talk about those trade routes again, right? We see the Byzantine Empire up here. We see down here the empire or the kingdom of Aksum. Now you'll notice these are these land-based trade routes that are linking the Byzantine Empire to the wealthy resources and civilizations of India and China, as well as in the Middle East. And then down here, by ways of the Red Sea and the Nile, you could get connection through Aksum to the monsoon marketplace that we talked about. So you see, really, the Byzantine Empire is this ideal place as it's this crossroads of all these different civilizations and trade, and they really benefit from all that. Now, one last thing I really want to talk about with the Byzantine Empire in this introduction is Christianity in the Byzantine Empire. So first and foremost, this picture isn't quite right. Remember, this is more likely what Jesus of Nazareth would have looked like. Well, the Byzantines, much like the Western Romans, were really big on Christianity after the time of Emperor Constantine. And they actually made it the official religion of the Byzantine emperors and the empire itself. And the Emperor Justinian wasn't just about trying to reconquer old lands, he was trying to settle disputes between Christians that were the subjects of his, right? So if Christianity is going to be an official religion that unites his people, he thought, he can't have them fighting amongst themselves about questions of the faith, what Christians believe and what they don't believe. So he tried to sell these arguments. One of the biggest arguments was the question, well, what exactly is Jesus of Nazareth, right? Is he God? Is he the Son of God? If you're a monotheistic religion, when you believe in only one God, how could Jesus be God if God is God, and still be monotheistic? So there's all these questions, and then there's a thing about the Holy Spirit. And so Justinian really tried to sort these things out so that Christians could have a clear set of ideas of what all Christians believed in. Spoiler alert, that really didn't work out. As you can see here, this is a kind of a branching of all the different Christian faiths. Early on, there were a bunch of different Christians who believe more or less the same thing. But as time goes on, you start to see different groups branching off with their own different beliefs. They're all Christians, but they believe different things. We're going to be really focusing on, in our next lesson, this period called the Great Schism, which was a division of the Christian church between Eastern Orthodox, which was practiced in the East in the Byzantine Empire, and Roman Catholicism, which was practiced in the West in what used to be the Roman Empire. So we'll get a little bit more into this into our next lesson, but it's something that I wanted to introduce because Christianity really is a big part of the Byzantine Empire. All right, that's enough for our introduction lesson. What you're going to be working on in class today is the handout, What Was the Byzantine Empire? So this is a New Zeller reading that you'll be doing, answering questions just like we usually do in class. But as you're reading the article, I want you to think about, what was this empire? Should it be remembered as a Greek empire? Should it be remembered as a Roman empire? Or should it be remembered as perhaps a Christian empire? So think about that as you're reading and answering these questions. So there really is that one reading assignment that you should be working on in class. There is a homework video on Justinian and Theodora that I puzzled for you, that you should be doing as well. You can do both during class time. You can do the video for the ed puzzle first and then the reading, then the ed puzzle. Really, it's your choice. But ideally, you want to have both of these done before our next class. We're together because we will be having a quiz on both the video and the reading. So any information from the video or the reading is fair game for that quiz. So that's what you should be working on this period. Again, all the while when you're reading about this empire, thinking about, should it be considered a Greek empire, a Roman empire, or a Christian empire? And while you're doing that, again, I highly recommend watching this video, this TED Talk, 5 minutes long, animated, pretty interesting stuff about the walls of Constantinople. I think you'll find it pretty interesting, especially the part where they're talking about, Greek fire, lighting people on fire and not being able to put it out by jumping into water. So really impressive walls. If you have questions, please reach out. That's what I'm here for, guys. Good luck, and we'll see you next class.